Okay, away we go. My name is Tom Moore. I'm the Vice President of the Peterborough chapter of the Ontario Archaeological Society. And yeah, this will be, I think, the last of our monthly Zoom meetings for a while. Tonight, we've had the theme this past season of women in archaeology. And tonight we are privileged to host Dr. Jennifer Birch. Okay, wasn't sure. Yeah, radiocarbon chronology building, and the construction of relational histories in Iroquois archaeology. At that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Jen. It's lovely having you here, and
Thanks, Tom, and thanks to the Peterborough chapter of the OAS for hosting this talk. Um, Peterborough has like a place in my heart. I did my undergraduate degree at Trent University between 1999 and 2003. Took classes with Dr. Morgan Tamplin, who I think is in the room. And it's nice to be able to kind of come back, as it were, to give this talk. So I have been engaged in this sort of radiocarbon chronology building work in Ontario, New York State, since about 2015. And I'll tell you guys, if you've heard me give this spiel before, I've given versions of this talk to a few different societies, including the Ottawa chapter of the OAS earlier in the fall. So if you've been to any of those and this is old hat to you, then by all means feel free to drift off. So I'm going to hopefully be able to advance my slides. There we go. So the way this talk's going to go is I'm going to start off by giving you a bit of a prologue to this larger project that my colleagues and I have called the Dating Iroquois project. I'll talk to you a little bit about some of the advances in radiocarbon dating and statistical treatments of radiocarbon dates that have allowed us to do this work. Talk about some of the major findings of the project and the implications of the work that we've done, and hopefully keep it all under about 35 to 40 minutes to leave us time for questions before everyone really drifts off for the evening. So to start off, A Tale of Two Villages. You guys know better than some of my audiences where the scene is set for this work. So we're in Southern Ontario. And you're also probably somewhat familiar with the two villages that I'm going to be talking to you about. The first is the site of Jean-Baptiste Launay, renamed in 2011 by the Huron-Wendat Nation and formerly known as the Mantle Site. And the other is the archaeological site of Warminster that is also known by as the village of Cayagüe. So if any of you are familiar with my work, you probably associate me with the Jean-Baptiste Launay or Mantle Site. This is a site that was excavated by Archaeological Services Incorporated between 2003 and 2005. I did my dissertation on this site at McMaster University. It is a very large village that housed probably about 1,800 people at its height. It's located just outside of Stouffville, Ontario. And it has a complicated occupational history that involved palisade contractions, overlapping longhouses. And in 2013, Ron Williamson and I wrote this book about the site. And at the time, our understanding was that it was a very large, late pre-contact village that probably dated to between about AD 1500 and 1530. This date was assigned based on understandings of the local ceramic seriation, as well as the presence of 3 pieces of European metal, including an iron axe fragment, and that axe fragment became sort of the main character in this documentary called Curse of the Axe that some of you may have seen. It's available on YouTube if you're interested. But basically, you know, the ceramics and this little bit of European metal caused us to think that the site dated to the early 16th century, and that these bits of metal were actually some of the very earliest European goods to have filtered into the lower Great Lakes via indirect trade. Now, the other village. The Warminster Cayaguay site was excavated, I believe, in the 50s and 60s. I think there might have been some work that was done there in the 1980s as well. I've talked to Bill Fox quite a bit about his, being present at the excavations at this site. It's a big double village, and it is full of European trade goods. Trade beads, iron axes, copper and brass, everything you would expect from an early 17th century village occupation. And of course, the Warminster site is perhaps best known as being associated with the village of Cayaguay, where Champlain overwintered in the winter of 1615-16, having been injured on a raid against the Onondaga with an assembled party of Wendat warriors and also other people from other groups. So I give you this prologue because all of our conventional archaeological wisdom about when these two sites are supposed to date to indicates that they should be occupied 100 years apart, right? With the Jean-Baptiste Launay or Mantle site around 1500 to 1530 and Warminster between about 1600 and 1630. So we initiated this project in 2015. And in 2018, my collaborator, Sturt Manning, and a number of our colleagues published this paper where we assembled 86 new radiocarbon dates from the Draper, Spang, and Jean-Baptiste Launay or Mantle sites, which are all thought to be sequential iterations of the same community, as well as the Warminster site. And what we found was that Jean-Baptiste Launay and Warminster were at least partly contemporary, having both been occupied in the very late 1500s to early 1600s. And I have to tell the assembled crowd that it took me probably about 2 years of grappling with these findings to come to terms with the fact that these two sites could be contemporary based on the disparities in European trade goods found at both sites. In fact, we are still grappling with these seemingly incongruous date estimates. And this that you're seeing here is a figure from a paper that my colleague and I just submitted to the journal Radiocarbon, where we hammered down on the Jean-Baptiste Launay or Mantle site data again and modeled it independently, so just this one site. And once again, what we're finding is that this site absolutely must date to the very late 1500s to early 1600s. All right, so where do we go from here? What makes this dating project, I think, so interesting and exciting, for me at least, is the fact that we know as archaeologists and people interested in archaeology that chronology fundamentally underpins everything else about what we do. So our assumptions about when sites or when certain kinds of material culture date to influences the kinds of research questions we ask, how we collect and interpret data, how we put apples and apples together or oranges and oranges. And chronologies also, in turn, determine the kinds of answers we are willing to accept, which is why it took me years of grappling with the data from the Jean-Baptiste Launay site to realize that it was secure. And chronologies also underpin all of the other explanatory frameworks for cultural processes in any given region. Here's what I mean by that. We have this conceptual scaffolding in our heads. And I borrow this term from a paper by Alison Wiley, another Canadian woman in archaeology. And she uses this phrase, conceptual scaffolding, to refer to all of the data, the analytical techniques, the models, and the assumptions that we use in our science. So this conceptual scaffolding isn't just the data, but it's also how we consider treating it. So in this way, it's not just what we know, but how we know it. And our conceptual scaffolding is always undergoing reconstruction as we apply new techniques to old data, as we discover new data, and as our approaches evolve, we have to reevaluate the ways that we construct knowledge and the stories that we tell ourselves about the past that are held up by this conceptual scaffolding. So you can think about this conceptual scaffolding as it applies to our understandings about the historical development of Northern Iroquoian societies. So I assume that many of you are mostly, or at least partly familiar with the pre-contact settlement landscape, at least in sort of the last, 1,000 years or so. So this project is situated in the lower Great Lakes. And our understandings about Northern Iroquoian archaeological history are actually fairly well fleshed out compared to some other regions in the world. This is sort of how we have traditionally sort of understood that timeline of the development of the Huron-Wendat society and societies of their ancestors, and that of the Haudenosaunee. So moving through these transitions to sedentary village life, early villages, it had been understood based on prior chronologies and archaeological data that around 1450 you tend to get this sort of escalation in conflict. In Ontario around 1450, we see a similar thing happening in New York around 1500. We've then thought in Ontario you have this sort of cessation of internal conflict. This is when we see the development of nations and alliances that then become the Huron-Wendat Confederacy, and that a similar process is playing out in New York State. But all of this, in terms of our understanding of the historical development of these societies, is dependent upon chronology. And we have these interconnected explanatory frameworks that underpin that story I just summarized for you, that's based on the distribution of village sites at any one point in time, population estimates that follow from that, understandings about environmental context and climate change, how people made a living, when we see these episodes of warfare beginning and intensifying, and the timing of coalescence and confederacy formation, and so on and so forth, right? These things are all pinned to that timeline, and so dependent upon assumptions about chronology. So traditionally, the ways that we have assigned sites or material culture to particular time periods have been based on ceramic seriation and the appearance of European manufactured goods in the late 1500s and early 1600s. This is the glass bead period, chronology, and so on. So what we set out to do in this project was combine pre-existing archaeological information with high precision radiocarbon data for selected Northern Iroquoian site sequences in Ontario and New York dating to the 15th through the 17th centuries. So this, to the best of my knowledge, has been the largest effort aimed at producing new radiocarbon age estimates for a large suite of sites in the Northern Iroquoian, Lower Great Lakes, Finger Lakes subregion. My primary collaborators in this work have been Stuart Manning at Cornell, but colleagues like Tim Abel, who I think is in the room still, and John Hart in New York have also been doing this kind of work, along with some of our collaborators abroad and graduate students here at UGA and at Cornell. And you can read about some of the work that we've done in these and other papers. This is just a selection. We've also had a lot of interest from sort of the public and the wider archaeological community in the project. We had a special thematic section of the SAA Archaeological Record back in September. And then just this month, a feature article in American Archaeologist magazine. So people are paying attention to this work, which really gets me excited because I've often felt that Iroquoian archaeology hasn't sort of received the kind of recognition within North America that it really deserves. So what did we do? We visited primarily museum collections, university laboratory collections, and places like sustainable archaeology, and collected samples, usually of short-lived organic materials. So think things like seeds and deer bone, if short-lived botanicals weren't available. Maize was the primary material that we dated for this project. And we collected around 250 new dates for 42 village sites associated with these site sequences or Haudenosaunee Nation. So we dated sites belonging to the ancestral Seneca and Onondaga sequences, as well as sites in the West Duffins Creek, Don, Humber, and Trent River Valley drainages in Ontario. And at the core of this project was the desire to understand how these refined chronologies could better help us understand the timing of coalescence, so the formation of very large villages, and the warfare that is thought to have contributed to those large villages being formed, the introduction and adoption of European manufactured goods, and then the socio-political developments surrounding the formation of nations and confederacies. So why has no one tried to do this previously? Well, to put it plainly, all of these interesting cultural and historical developments happened during a very messy period in the radiocarbon calibration curve. Briefly, the amount of carbon-14 that's absorbed into living tissues while they're alive on this planet is dependent on a host of Earth systems processes that mainly have to do with the amount of solar radiation and the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere at any one point in time. In this period between the late 1400s and the early 1600s, we actually have a plateau and reversal in the radiocarbon calibration curve, which means that, for example, you have two dates here that we know come from samples that lived and died in 1550 and 1600 AD, but they hit at multiple points on the radiocarbon calibration curve. And what this means is that, take for example these two radiocarbon dates from the Mantle site, which we had in hand when we published the book, they had two intercepts. And so really what archaeologists would do previously when faced with these two different potential dates is pick the one that better fit their understanding of the material culture chronology. So in this case with the Mantle site, we were initially like, oh, that date around 1500, that is the one that we are going to choose. So to overcome this, in this project what we did was tried to date as much as possible short-lived samples, so things that lived and died within a single calendar year, like maize. We collected samples from whenever possible across what we understood to be the entire occupational span of a site, and then we combined those radiocarbon data in statistical models that incorporated prior archaeological knowledge. So that prior archaeological knowledge might be something like layers in a midden, or the occupational history of a site in terms of understanding which longhouses came before others. More recently, we've started actually using wood charcoal that has an inbuilt age as a TPQ or a known prior for the maize samples that are likely to be younger than those older wood samples. And in some cases, we used other statistical tests to independently verify the order of site occupations. I'm not going to drone on about methods, but I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have at the end of the talk. So we dated 42 sites from these 6 different sequences. And I'm just going to summarize for you what we came up with. What you're looking at on this admittedly very busy slide is the traditional sort of culture historical chronology on the right, and on the left, the new chronology. All of the X's on these 2 charts refer to sites where we have human remains bearing signs of perimortem trauma interpreted as evidence for conflict. And you can't really, it's not showing up super well on this slide, but the palisaded settlements also have a slightly bolder line around them. So 2 things I want to point out about how the new chronology differs from the traditional chronology in meaningful ways. The first is that the revised date estimates for these sites now more closely reflect the average less than 40-year occupational span of each settlement. We know from the ethnohistoric record, from work by people like Gary Warwick, that Iroquoian village sites were really only occupied for between, I want to say about 10 and 40 years, but more often in sort of the 20 to 25 year range. And so whereas previously our age estimates for sites kind of plopped them into sometimes a 50, less often sort of a 20 or 25 year spot on the calendar, what the new age estimates do is actually allow us to more closely approximate the actual duration of those village occupations. So you can see here, for example, a site like the Seneca site, Richmond Mills, being occupied from 1500 to 1550 in the old date estimate. We can now really focus that in at 1503 to 1523. You can see a few examples of that. The other big finding, and this is what's most important for our understandings of the Ontario ancestral Huron-Wendat archaeological record, is that the new dates pull multiple sites across the north shore of Lake Ontario. So think here from sort of West Stephens Creek and Ajax over to the Humber River, pull them more recent in time. So sites like Black Creek, that was previously thought to be occupied 1400 to 1450, and all of these other sites in the Don Valley are now understood to date to as much as a century later. So we're now looking at these sites being occupied in the 1470s, and these sites with the big black X's that have big defensive palisades and evidence of violent conflict, instead of dating to 1450 or so, they've for the most part been pulled back to after 1500, and in the case of sites like Heifer and Draper, to about the 1550s. In New York, there wasn't a lot of movement in the traditional chronology, which we think was actually good. We were glad to have found that in some cases the original date estimates were solid, and in other cases they moved around. And indeed, it was this, when we started getting these results back, it started making us feel a lot better about our initial data coming out of the Draper, Spang, Jean-Baptiste Linné sequence, because it showed that it wasn't just that one site sequence that had been misplaced in time, but it was the whole sequence across the North Shore of Lake Ontario. So what does this all mean? What did we learn from doing this? So first, our thinking about the timing of conflict, and in particular internal conflict among the Haudenosaunee and Huron-Wendat, has changed dramatically. This is one of the biggest things that I think is important about the data. So whereas previously we had thought that there was internal conflict among Huron-Wendat communities around 1450 and internal conflict among Haudenosaunee communities after about 1500, what we're now thinking is that instead We have this internal conflict among the Haudenosaunee, which is very familiar to anyone who has read or is familiar with sort of the oral history of the founding of the Great League of Peace and Power, in that we've always known that there was internal conflict among the Haudenosaunee that ceased with the formation of the League. But now what we're starting to think is that there was no or very little corresponding internal conflict among the ancestors of the Huron-Wendat, and instead this coalescence and defensive posturing is far more likely a response to aggression from the Haudenosaunee than it was internal conflict in that society. So what was assumed to have been conflict that was influenced by the fur trade and begun in the late 1500s and early 1600s, in fact, started a century earlier. And by the time you get into the early 1500s, we're seeing this conflict sort of coming around both ends of Lake Ontario, resulting probably in the abandonment of northern New York, and that's work that Tim has published on. And so this, for me, has been sort of a big game changer in terms of how we understand both internal societal interactions as well as external relations. Another aspect of this project has been sort of rethinking the nature of the transmission of especially very early European trade goods into these community sequences. And what you can sort of see here is that there are some areas, in particular on the north shore of Lake Ontario here, again with sort of the Draper, Keffer, Don, and West Duffin sequences, whereby some communities seem to be not accessing, accepting, or being involved in these exchange networks in the way that other communities are. I have a PhD student named Megan Conger who is specifically taking on this issue of very early European trade goods and their dating and expanding this work beyond what we've done here into the Tainatante and neutral protohistoric sequences as well. So we'll all be excited to see her dissertation when it is complete. So in terms of that timeline that I was telling you about earlier, here's how the dating has kind of changed our understandings of the historical development of these societies. So rather than sort of a parallel process of intensification of internal conflict that leads to the formation of nations that then ally into confederacies, instead we see these processes happening sort of earlier in New York, initiation of conflict with the Haudenosaunee for the Huron-Wendat in the mid-1500s, and then population movement up to Simcoe County following that. And so this is where we need to sort of take this new understanding about the historical development of these societies and start rethinking our models. This phrase, contentious and contemporaneous confederacies, comes from a really wonderful book by Anthony Wenderly and Martha Simpowski about the founding of the origins of the League of the Haudenosaunee. And I think previously a lot of scholars working in Huron-Wendat archaeology and history have kind of taken that model of Haudenosaunee confederacy formation and applied it to similar processes happening north of Lake Ontario. And I think what this work has shown us, at least has shown me, is that these histories of relations were far more complicated. It involved both top-down and bottom-up processes in these societies in ways that are far more complex than those earlier sort of more simplified models. And in this way, in terms of thinking about our conceptual scaffolding and these top-down and bottom-up processes, we've started combining these new understandings about chronology to social network analysis, and a lot of this is work that has been led by our colleague John Hart, in terms of looking at the social networks that are embodied in ceramic decoration and how the social networks of the Huron-Wendat and Haudenosaunee differed and how these new histories kind of inform the way that these networks developed. And so, the Huron-Wendat had this very sort of close, what we call like a bonding network that was based on sort of costly reciprocity and a lot of intense face-to-face interaction engendered by their sort of being pushed together onto in historic Wendake, versus these more bridging social networks that existed among the Haudenosaunee, where you have these groups that are linked by sort of formal, rigid diplomatic protocols. That was the result of this very formal process of how their confederacy formed. More recently, we've started looking sort of down at the community level here. And this is a brand new paper that just came out in the most recent issue of American Antiquity, where John and I looked again at social networks. And what we realized in this sort of re-look at the North Shore of Lake Ontario is that sites in that West Duffin sequence that are earlier, that are sort of pre-1550 or 1570, so the Pew, Draper, and Spang sites, all really have really similar ceramic assemblages. But the Mantle or Jean-Baptiste Launay site and a site that's associated with it, Aurora, actually have ceramics that cluster more similarly with sites further to the west. And what we think is happening, again, based on our understandings of the social network analysis combined with these new chronologies, is that the escalation of conflict with the Haudenosaunee and the expanding buffer zone with populations in northwestern New York is leading to population movement across these community relocation sequences, whereby previously we'd thought that changes at the Mantle or Jean-Baptiste Launay site were owing to internal reorganization, but instead what we think we're seeing is actually flows of people from west to east trying to get away from that sort of frontier of hostilities with the Haudenosaunee. So, again, it's all about the ways that by tinkering with these chronological placements of site occupations, helps us to rethink how individuals made decisions and how not only communities acted, but how people might have moved across these different communities during these time periods. So, and I know I've thrown a lot at you here, but I think for me the big takeaway points from this project have been that when we have imprecise, blocky chronologies, we end up with similarly imprecise, blocky narratives about how societies worked and how these histories unfolded. And by enhancing our chronological resolution, we can start to privilege real relationships that happened in real time between communities, and in turn generate new historical and conceptual scaffolding that causes us to ask new questions, collect new data, and conduct new kinds of analyses. And so for that reason, the work that we've done should definitely be understood as not sort of, here's the new chronology, here's the new history, but instead as a call for further action and investigation and more work and more questioning. I've been consulting and collaborating with the Huron-Wendat Nation since the very inception of this project. And it's really generated a lot of great conversations, great interactions, new insights about their past, and also new research directions whereby the Huron-Wendat Nation is going to be sort of directing the next stages of this research in terms of the kinds of questions they would like to see answered. So thanks to you all for listening to me for what I hope was legitimately about 35 minutes. And thanks to all, to the National Science Foundation for funding this research, all of our wonderful collaborators, and all of the people at repositories and museums in Ontario and New York that made this possible. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Jen. Before we go to questions, I mentioned earlier that I was Plan B in terms of hosting, and as I bumbled my way into my duties, I was uncharacteristically remiss in not acknowledging that we are meeting here anyway, up in the north, in the traditional lands of the Mississauga Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee First Nations, and that we thank them for their stewardship of these territories. So I wanted to get that in. I got the elbow from my wife saying, so there's that. If I can turn it over for questions now. There's Cheryl.
Hello.
Hello,
Thank
Cheryl.
you so much. Hi, Jen. Thank you, Tom. I missed the very beginning, but got most of Jen's talk. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that you've shared so much information with us. And I would like to ask if there are questions tonight that you might answer. You'll have to unmute yourself if you want to do that.
Okay, I'll jump in with a question.
Hi.
Hi, Jen. Okay, so one of the things that struck me when I was looking at some of your charts was the you were talking about the 40-year time period for each of these sites, and I noticed Seed Barker, which is one, a site that I'm familiar with, is really a lot longer than 40 years. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that and why that might be.
No, that is a great question. So the better data we have for sites, the better able we are to pin them down on those wiggles in the calibration curve. And Seed Barker is one of those sites that it probably had a similarly sort of shortish occupation. And I've had some conversations with Bob Berger recently, who seems to have picked up his dissertation work on the
Yep.
site again. So that I don't think is a reflection of actually how long the site was occupied, but the way the statistical model sort of spit out a date estimate for
Okay.
Seed Barker. But I can tell you that the collections that the TRCA holds for Seed Barker have massive amounts of very well contextualized botanicals, where you could throw 50 radiocarbon dates at that site if one had the funding to do it, and you could really pin down where it actually fits. So there were also some sites, like in the Trent Valley, the Jameson site. Peter Ramsden very graciously provided, I think, 2 samples maybe from Jameson. So it also has sort of a spread out occupation, and it's because it's not as well dated as some of the other ones. So
Okay.
it's a really good question, and like those charts kind of obscure some of the complexities going on in the background in that way.
Well, that was fascinating and a lot more understandable than many of the papers that I've tried to read.
It can be a lot.
A lot.
Yes.
If you're not immersed in it, right?
I think, Jen, that your experience as a professor has made it easier for you to explain hard things simply.
Yes, and us simple folk appreciate it.
No, it's and I know some of it is still probably a bit too technical. So yeah.
No, not a bit. Not a bit. I know Peter. I know where he lives. If you need me to punch him out, I will. Are there other questions for Jennifer tonight? Well, if not, I'm going to turn it over to Tom to thank you. And I want to especially say thank you to Tom for taking over at the beginning. So thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. I'm glad I was able to make it work. It was a little clunky on my behalf, but anyway, Jen, thank you very much for joining us tonight. You did make a complicated issue very understandable. And I just wanted to, we are going to pass along one of our highly coveted chapter mugs. And that'll be, sent down your way shortly. And yeah, thank you again for joining us this evening.
Oh, I so appreciate it, and I hope to, within reason, make it back to Peterborough within the next few years, and maybe say hello to some folks in person. I miss it.
I know. You're from Curtis and you went to Trent, and I know you have a ticket booked to come home. but family first, right?
Yes,
Family
yes,
first. Yeah,
yes.
for
I'm
sure.
looking forward to seeing my parents. Yeah, but thank you so much for having me, and thanks to everyone who showed up on a summer evening. I appreciate the turnout.
Kind of warm.
It's pouring out right now, so
Pouring and
Good for
thundering.
the mosquitoes. Yeah,
yeah, it's keeping the mosquitoes down. Sure.
yeah.
Okay.
Many
Well,
thanks, Jen. Good
thanks.
night.
I'll hang out for a minute in case anyone has questions as people are leaving the
Sure.
room. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Jen. That was really good.
Thanks.
So, are you feeling better after your adventure?
Oh yeah, much. I've managed to knock my course of steroids in half today, so much less like jittery. Tom, I don't know if you saw, like, I got attacked by wasps on Saturday and ended up in the ER. So everything's much better now.
Well, I'm congratulations on your recovery. So did you stumble across a nest?
Yeah, I ran my lawnmower over a yellow jacket,
Oh.
underground yellow jacket nest, and yeah, haven't run that fast, I don't think, since I was a kid. So yeah, but all's well now. So thanks for asking, Cheryl.
Well, that happened to me once when my cousin and I were playing around the back of our island at the cottage. And we walked through a nest and we had to jump into the lake. It was
Sen-
horrible.